There is a strip of land at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea that is roughly the size of New Jersey, that has almost no oil, no great navigable rivers, no extraordinary natural resources, of the kind that typically explain why a piece of geography becomes important. And yet, this specific piece of land, the hills of Judea, the coastal plain, the Jordan River Valley, the city on the hill that three of the world's great religions call holy, has produced more history, more conflict, more human suffering, and more human aspiration than territories 100 times its size. To understand why requires going back not to the modern era, not to the 19th century's nationalist movements, not even to the medieval crusades, but to the specific moment, 3,000 years ago, when a people decided that this land was not merely where they lived, but where God had told them to live. That conviction, maintained through exile, through persecution, through 2 millennia of forced absence, is the oldest thread in one of the most complicated stories in human history. The Hebrew Bible's account of the covenant between God and the Jewish people is, whatever else one believes about it, one of the most historically consequential documents ever written. It describes a promise that the land of Canaan, the narrow strip between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, would belong to the descendants of Abraham, and it describes the specific conditions of that promise, the obligations that both parties accepted. The Israelites, in the biblical account, were not the only people in Canaan when they arrived. They were, for centuries, one people among several in a contested landscape, building and losing kingdoms, forming and breaking alliances, worshipping and abandoning, and returning to the God who had promised them the land. Under King David, in the 10th century BC, the disparate tribes consolidated into a kingdom with Jerusalem as its capital. Under Solomon, that kingdom built the temple on Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount that would become the most sacred site in Jewish religious practice, the specific physical location toward which every subsequent Jewish prayer about return was directed. The Babylonian Empire destroyed the first temple in 586 BC and carried the Jewish elite into captivity in Babylon. This was not merely a military defeat, it was a theological crisis of the first order, because the temple's destruction raised the specific question that the exile would require the Jewish people to answer. How do you maintain a religious identity that is centered on a physical location when you no longer have access to that location? The answer: they developed a portable Judaism centered on text, on law, on communal practice, on the calendar and the prayers that could be carried in the mind and the heart across any distance, was one of the most consequential religious innovations in human history. The Jewish people returned to their land when the Persian king Cyrus permitted it, in 539 BC. They built a second temple. They were subsequently governed by the Persians, then by Alexander the Great, then by his successors, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, each new imperial master bringing different levels of tolerance and different degrees of pressure toward cultural assimilation. The Maccabean revolt of 167 to 160 BC was triggered by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV's attempt to suppress Jewish religious practice, to ban the Torah, to require worship of Greek gods, to desecrate the temple with offerings to Zeus. The priestly Maccabee family's military resistance produced the Hasmonean dynasty, an independent Jewish state that lasted for roughly a century and is commemorated every year in the festival of Hanukkah. The Romans ended that independence in 63 BC, when the general Pompey marched into Jerusalem and entered the temple's Holy of Holies, entering the most sacred room in the most sacred building, the room where no one but the high priest was permitted, entering it because he could, because he was Roman, and the rules of other people's gods did not apply to him. The Jewish people remained under Roman rule for the next several centuries, with varying degrees of autonomy and varying degrees of resistance. The destruction of the Second Temple by the Roman general Titus in 70 AD was the event that most directly produced the modern conflict. The Jewish population scattered across the Roman Empire and beyond, beginning the diaspora that would last 2,000 years. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman city. The Jews were forbidden from entering it. And, from this point forward, the Jewish relationship with the land of Israel became not the relationship of a people with the place they live, but the relationship of a people with the place they are trying to return, to a longing maintained through prayer, through the specific geography of ritual, through the direction of prayer and the texts of Passover, and the phrase at the year's end that said, "Next year in Jerusalem." The land those prayers were directed toward did not stand empty in the 2,000 years that followed. Other peoples lived in it, farmed it, built on it, and came to regard it as their own. Understanding what happened when the people who had never stopped praying to return encountered the people who had never stopped living there requires understanding the specific forces of the modern world that brought that encounter to its end. Crisis point. 2,000 years is longer than most civilizations have existed. The Roman Empire that destroyed the temple and scattered the Jewish population is itself long gone. The Byzantine Empire that followed it is gone. The Crusader kingdoms, the Ottoman Empire, the colonial powers that carved up the Middle East, all gone. The Jewish people are still here, and the connection to the land from which they were dispersed is still the organizing fact of their communal prayer. This is the thing that requires understanding before anything else about the modern conflict can be understood. The Jewish diaspora was not a forgetting. It was a 2,000-year act of deliberate remembering, conducted across dozens of countries in dozens of languages, sustained by a religious practice that embedded the geography of the Holy Land into the daily life of every observant Jew on earth. 3 times a day, the prayers were directed toward Jerusalem. Every Passover, the Seder ended with the same words. Every Yom Kippur, the same conclusion. Next year in Jerusalem, it was not metaphor, it was intention. The communities of the diaspora were not uniform in their experience or their achievement. In Babylon, where Jewish communities had lived since the 6th century BC, the great academies produced the Babylonian Talmud, the massive compilation of Jewish law and commentary that became the foundation of Jewish religious practice for the next 2,000 years. In the Islamic world of the early medieval period, Jewish communities participated in the extraordinary intellectual culture of the caliphate, producing philosophers, physicians, and poets, most famously Maimonides, the 12th century rabbi and physician and philosopher, whose synthesis of Jewish law and Greek philosophy remains one of the most important works in the Jewish intellectual tradition. In medieval Spain, under both Islamic and Christian rule, Jewish communities achieved levels of cultural and political integration that made the Iberian Peninsula seem, for a time, like the closest thing to a Jewish homeland that existed outside the land of Israel itself. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed for the Americas, in a coincidence that reflects the specific character of the age of European expansion, was one of the most devastating single events in the history of the diaspora. Perhaps 200,000 people were expelled from communities that had existed for centuries, from lives and homes and businesses and relationships that they were required to abandon in a matter of months. They scattered across the Ottoman Empire, across North Africa, across the remaining Jewish communities of Europe, carrying with them the Ladino language and the specific Sephardic culture that the Inquisition was trying to destroy. The Inquisition did not destroy it. The communities that survived carried it forward. Eastern Europe became the center of Jewish life in the centuries after the Spanish expulsion, and the great Ashkenazi communities of Poland and Russia and Lithuania produced an extraordinary density of Jewish cultural and intellectual achievement: the Hasidic movement, the Yiddish language and its literature, the great rabbinical academies of Vilna and Volozhin, the specific urban culture of cities like Warsaw and Odessa, where Jewish communities had developed a way of life so rich and so distinctive that its destruction in the Holocaust would leave a gap in the fabric of European civilization that has never been filled. These communities also experienced the specific violence of the pogrom, the organized massacre that the Russian and Ukrainian populations, often with government encouragement and sometimes with government participation, conducted against Jewish communities in waves of killing that drove millions of Jews westward and across the Atlantic to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Theodor Herzl watched the Dreyfus Affair unfold in Paris in 1894 with the specific attention of someone who had believed, until that moment, that Western European liberalism had produced a kind of society in which a Jewish person's Jewishness was irrelevant to their civic participation. Alfred Dreyfus was a French army officer, a French citizen, educated in France, serving in the French military, who was convicted of treason on the basis of forged evidence and the specific anti-Semitic assumption that a Jewish officer's loyalty to France was inherently questionable. The crowds outside the courtroom shouting death to the Jews were not in Russia, they were in Paris. Herzl, covering the trial as a journalist, concluded that what he was seeing was not a failure of French liberalism, but a revelation of its limits, that Jewish emancipation in Europe was not the solution to the Jewish problem, because the European societies that had granted legal equality to Jewish citizens had not shed the anti-Semitism that made that equality conditional. Zionism offered a specific answer to what it called the Jewish question, not better laws, not more effective political lobbying, not class struggle, but a state, a specifically Jewish state, in the land that Jewish prayers had been directed toward for 2,000 years. Herzl organized, fundraised, lobbied European governments, and died in 1904 at the age of 44, having spent the last years of his life in the work of political advocacy, without living to see any of its results. The movement he built survived him because it was organized around an argument that events would eventually make unanswerable. The land that Herzl's movement had identified as the destination for this return was not empty. It was inhabited by an Arab-Palestinian population that had its own connection to the land, its own emerging national consciousness, and its own understanding of what the arriving European Jewish immigrants represented for their future. What happened when these two histories met in the same narrow strip of land is the story that the rest of this documentary will tell. At the beginning of the 20th century, the land that would become Israel was a dusty, sun-baked province at the southern end of the Ottoman Empire, a place of small cities and farming villages and ancient roads, populated primarily by Arab Palestinians, who had been farming its hillsides and working its coastal towns for centuries, a small but growing Jewish community that had been immigrating in increasing numbers since the 1880s, and a Christian minority concentrated in and around the cities whose religious significance drew pilgrims from across the world. The Ottoman Empire that governed this territory was dying the sick man of Europe, as the diplomatic phrase had it, and the European powers that were positioning themselves to inherit its territories were not thinking primarily about the people who lived in those territories. They were thinking about strategic routes to India, about the Suez Canal, about oil that was beginning to reveal itself in the Persian Gulf region, about the specific advantage that control of the Eastern Mediterranean would provide in the next conflict between European powers. The people who lived in Palestine were not the primary consideration of the men who were about to decide Palestine's future. The Balfour Declaration of the 2nd of November, 1917, was a letter, a single page, 67 words, in its key passage from the British Foreign Secretary to a prominent Jewish banker, expressing the British government's support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It was produced through a specific combination of genuine sympathy, strategic calculation, and wartime desperation. The genuine sympathy was real. Several members of the British government, including Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour himself, had a specific Protestant-inflected sympathy for the Zionist project that drew on the Christian tradition of viewing the Jewish return to the Holy Land as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The strategic calculation was equally real. British officials believed, incorrectly as it turned out, that a pro-Zionist declaration would influence the large and politically significant Jewish communities of the United States and Russia to support the Allied war effort. The wartime desperation was the context that made both factors decisive. Britain, in the autumn of 1917, was fighting a war whose outcome was not yet certain, and the calculation that a letter to Lord Rothschild might produce strategic benefits was sufficient justification for making promises whose long-term consequences were not fully thought through. The declaration's specific language was the product of negotiation between those who wanted a more explicit promise and those who wanted a more explicit protection for the existing population. What emerged was a document that promised a great deal without specifying what it meant. A national home for the Jewish people was not a state. The word state was not used, and the distinction was not accidental. It was a formulation designed to be interpreted as broadly as Zionists needed and as narrowly as Arab Palestinians needed, which meant it would inevitably satisfy neither and disappoint both. The protection of the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities was a genuine commitment in the declaration's text that was not accompanied by any mechanism for its enforcement, any specification of what rights were protected, or any acknowledgement that a national home defined by one community's identity might be structurally incompatible with the preservation of another community's political rights. These were not oversights. They were the specific evasions of people who needed to make promises they could not keep. What makes the Balfour Declaration most revealing is what was happening simultaneously with its composition. In 1916, a year before the Declaration, a British civil servant named Mark Sykes and a French diplomat named François-Georges Picot had concluded a secret agreement that divided the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire between Britain and France in lines drawn on a map, with a ruler. The Sykes-Picot Agreement created the borders of the modern Middle East, the specific lines that separate Syria from Iraq, Lebanon from Syria, Jordan from Palestine, with the specific disregard for ethnic, tribal, religious, and historical realities that characterized European colonial cartography at its most confident. The people whose lands were being divided were not consulted. The agreement was made in secret while Britain was simultaneously promising the Arab leader Hussein ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, an independent Arab kingdom, in exchange for the Arab revolt against the Ottomans. Hussein led the Arab revolt. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, helped organize and publicize it, creating in the process one of the most romanticized colonial military adventures in British history. The Arab fighters who rose against the Ottomans believed they were fighting for their independence. They were fighting for Britain's strategic interest, which was not the same thing, and which British officials knew was not the same thing, while they were making the promises that disguised the difference. When the war ended, and the post-war settlement at San Remo in 1920 distributed the Ottoman territories among the victorious European powers, Hussein received not the independent Arab kingdom he had been promised, but a series of positions for his sons in territories that were themselves under British and French mandatory authority. Britain got Palestine and Iraq. France got Syria and Lebanon. The Arabs got borders they had not drawn around identities they had not chosen in a political arrangement that served the interests of people who did not live there. Into this specific landscape of broken promises and drawn borders, the Jewish immigration to Palestine was accelerating. The people arriving were not conquerors in any conventional sense. They were buying land, building communities, creating institutions. But what they were building was visible to the Arab Palestinians who were watching it, and what they saw was not immigration. It was the advance party of a transformation whose political consequences for themselves they were beginning to understand in ways that would produce the most consequential conflict of the century. The British arrived in Palestine in 1920, carrying two promises they could not both keep, governing a territory whose two main communities both believed, with reasons, that British authority was supposed to serve their interests. The mandatory system that the League of Nations created after the First World War was, in its formal structure, a trust. Britain was administering Palestine on behalf of the international community until the territory was ready for self-governance. In practice, it was an occupation that was supposed to produce a national home for one community while protecting the existing rights of another, in a territory where the two goals were becoming, as time passed and immigration increased, less compatible rather than more. The British officials who administered the mandate were not uniformly cynical or incompetent. Many of them understood the contradiction they had been handed. None of them found a way to resolve it, because the contradiction was not resolvable within the political framework they had been given. The Jewish immigration that accelerated through the 1920s and 1930s was not primarily the product of ideology, though ideology was present. It was primarily the product of persecution. The Jews who left Eastern Europe for Palestine in the 1920s were leaving communities where the pogrom was a recurring reality, where civic equality was theoretical and physical safety was not guaranteed. The Jews who left Germany and Austria and Poland in the 1930s were leaving societies where a government had decided their elimination was official policy. The specific character of the immigration that resulted people who had chosen Palestine over the United States or Argentina because they believed in the Zionist project, people who arrived with professional skills and intellectual resources, and the specific organizational intensity of people who understood they were building something rather than merely relocating produced in Palestine, not merely a growing Jewish population but a growing Jewish society. The Histadrut Labor Federation the Haganah Defense Organization, the Hebrew-language newspapers and schools and cultural institutions, the agricultural settlements of the kibbutz movement. These were not the infrastructure of immigrants. They were the infrastructure of a state being assembled before the state existed. The Arab Palestinians who watched this process were not passive observers of their own displacement. They had their own newspapers, their own political organizations, their own developing sense of Palestinian national identity that was being sharpened, as nationalist identities often are, by the specific threat that the immigration represented. The specific threat was visible and measurable. Land that had been Arab-owned was becoming Jewish-owned through the land purchases that the Zionist organizations were conducting. Villages that had employed Arab Palestinian farmers as tenants were being converted, as land changed hands, into Jewish agricultural settlements that employed Jewish labor. The demographic change was visible in every city and every rural district, and what it was changing was not merely the cultural character of individual neighborhoods, but the political balance of a territory whose future was still being contested. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 was the most consequential Palestinian political and military action before the 1948 war, and it is one of the most instructive moments in the conflict's history because it demonstrates the specific trap that the Palestinian political situation had already created by the late 1930s. The general strike that began the revolt was the longest in the history of the Arab world. 6 months of economic self-paralysis that hurt the Arab-Palestinian economy more than it hurt the Jewish economy, which was increasingly self-sufficient. The guerrilla campaign that followed was directed against both the British Mandatory Authority and the Jewish community, but the British military response, which at various points included the demolition of houses, collective punishments, and the arming of Jewish auxiliary forces who gained military experience that would prove decisive in 1948, damaged the Palestinian military capacity more than it damaged its British or Jewish targets. The Arab revolt weakened the Palestinian community at precisely the moment when strength was most needed. The Peel Commission report of 1937, produced in response to the Arab revolt, proposed the first official partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. The proposed Jewish state was small, a coastal strip, and the Galilee and the proposed Arab state was to be merged with the British-controlled territory of Transjordan. The Zionist leadership accepted the partition as a basis for negotiation, not because the territory was sufficient, but because the principle of Jewish statehood was being acknowledged by an official British commission for the first time. The Arab-Palestinian leadership rejected it, and the rejection was not irrational. The partition proposal asked the Arab majority to accept a state on a minority of the territory they inhabited, in exchange for recognizing the legitimacy of the Jewish national project that they had consistently opposed. Accepting it meant accepting that the Jewish immigration, which they had resisted precisely because of its political implications, had produced political facts that could not be reversed. What the rejection of Peel produced was the British White Paper of 1939, which severely restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine in response to Arab pressure, a policy that came into force at the precise moment when the Jews of Europe needed a destination most urgently, when the Nazi regime was making the specific danger of Jewish existence in Europe visible to anyone willing to look. The White Paper was, from the Zionist perspective, the most complete demonstration that dependence on British goodwill was a policy that would kill people. From that point forward, the Jewish community in Palestine prepared not to negotiate with Britain for its national home, but to fight Britain, if necessary, to achieve it. The war that was consuming Europe simultaneously was about to resolve the question that British policy had kept deliberately ambiguous. When it ended, the world would discover what 6 million murdered people meant for the political argument about whether Jewish people needed a state. The Holocaust did not create the case for Israel. It made the case unanswerable. The Holocaust ended in the spring of 1945 with the liberation of the concentration camps and the discovery, by Allied soldiers who had been told what to expect and were nonetheless not prepared for what they found, of what the Nazi regime had accomplished. The specific human reality of what was discovered, the living skeletons in the barracks, the mass graves, the crematoria, the meticulous German records of 6 million individual murders produced in the world a specific moral response, a collective acknowledgement that what had happened was not merely a war crime, but a demonstration of something about the specific danger of Jewish statelessness in a world where governments could decide, with complete institutional efficiency, to murder all of their Jewish citizens. The Holocaust did not create the Zionist argument. It answered every objection to it. The Jews of Europe who had believed that assimilation was working, that civic equality was real, that being a German or a French or a Hungarian citizen was sufficient protection against the specific vulnerability that anti-Semitism created, those Jews were dead. The argument they had made with their lives was buried with them. The 250,000 Jewish survivors in the displaced persons camps of post-war Europe existed in a specific political limbo that was simultaneously a humanitarian catastrophe and a political argument. They could not go back to Poland, where their communities had been destroyed and where returning Jews were being murdered in pogroms as late as 1946. They could not easily emigrate to the United States, which had restrictive immigration quotas that were not lifted in response to the Holocaust's revelation. They could not legally go to Palestine, because the British White Paper of 1939 was still nominally in force, and the British Navy was actively intercepting the ships that were trying to bring Holocaust survivors to the one place that was trying to receive them. The specific image of British naval vessels intercepting ships carrying concentration camp survivors, turning them back, imprisoning them on Cyprus, was the most effective single recruiting tool that the Zionist movement had ever possessed, because it demonstrated in one image the specific political reality that made a Jewish state necessary. The Jewish underground organizations in Palestine conducted a military campaign against the British Mandatory Authority that combined military operations with political theatre. The Irgun, commanded by a Polish-born lawyer named Menachem Begin, who would eventually become Israel's prime minister, conducted operations that the British government characterized as terrorism, including the 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which served as British military headquarters, killing 91 people, among them British officers, Arab Palestinians, and Jewish workers. The Haganah, the mainstream Jewish military organization, conducted operations that were less deliberately provocative, but equally focused on making the cost of the British presence in Palestine politically unsustainable. The combination worked, not because the Jewish underground forces could defeat the British military, they could not, but because the political will in Britain to sustain the mandate was collapsing under the combined pressure of the military campaign, the international criticism of the treatment of Holocaust survivors, and the simple economic reality that Britain in 1947 was exhausted and broke from 6 years of war. The United Nations Special Committee on Palestine produced, in the summer of 1947, its recommendation that the territory be partitioned into separate Jewish and Arab states, the Jewish state receiving approximately 56% of the territory, the Arab state receiving approximately 43%, with Jerusalem under international administration. The recommendation was adopted by the UN General Assembly as Resolution 181 on the 29th of November 1947, passing with 33 votes in favor, 13 against, and 10 abstentions. The Soviet Union voted in favor. The United States voted in favor. The Arab states voted against, and announced that they would not accept the partition's implementation by force if necessary. The Jewish Agency's acceptance of the partition was not enthusiastic. The territory assigned was not what the Zionist movement had hoped for, and the exclusion of Jerusalem from the Jewish state was a specific source of anguish. But it was acceptance, because the alternative to accepting less than was wanted was to reject the principle of international recognition of Jewish statehood, and that was a price the Jewish Agency's leadership was not willing to pay. The Arab rejection was not surprising. The Arab states had been consistent in their opposition to any partition that created a Jewish state on any portion of the territory, but it was consequential, because it meant that the Jewish state, if it came into existence, would do so in the context of a military confrontation rather than a negotiated settlement. David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel in a Tel Aviv museum on the afternoon of the 14th of May, 1948, as the British mandate expired. The people assembled in the room wept. Some of them were Holocaust survivors who had been in concentration camps 3 years earlier. Some of them had spent their adult lives working for this moment and could not fully believe it had arrived. Ben-Gurion's voice, preserved in the recording, is steady and precise, the voice of a man who has been preparing for this moment for decades and who understands that the work of the declaration is the easy part. The armies of 5 Arab states were massing on the borders. The war for the state that had just been declared was beginning. What happened next was simultaneously the military birth of the modern state of Israel and the catastrophe that Palestinians call the Nakba, the same events, the same weeks, the same villages and roads, producing 2 experiences so different from each other that the people who lived them could barely recognize that they were describing the same events. Both experiences were real. Understanding them both is the only way to understand what the conflict that followed was actually about. The same war has 2 names because it produced 2 completely different experiences for the people who lived through it, and both names are honest. For the Jewish community of Palestine and for Jews around the world, the 1948 war was the War of Independence, the military struggle that transformed the Declaration of May 14 from a piece of paper into a functioning state, that proved the Jewish people could defend themselves against the armies of multiple nations, that answered the specific vulnerability of 2,000 years of diaspora, with the specific protection of a country, an army, and a flag. For the Palestinian Arab community, the same war was the Nakba, the catastrophe, the event in which approximately 700,000 people fled or were expelled from the homes and the villages and the land that their families had inhabited for generations, producing a refugee population whose descendants now number in the millions and whose status as stateless people without a permanent home remains, 75 years later, the most unresolved single issue in the entire conflict. These 2 experiences are not competing claims about what happened. They are both accurate descriptions of what happened. Understanding both is the only way to understand why the conflict has proven so resistant to resolution. Israel's military situation in the war's opening weeks was genuinely dangerous. The newly declared state was facing the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon simultaneously, with a combined population and theoretical military capacity that significantly exceeded what the 650,000 Jewish civilians of the new state could field. The United Nations arms embargo that accompanied the ceasefire efforts was being violated by the Arab states, which were receiving weapons and military support from their backers, while Israel was scrambling to purchase weapons through whatever channels were available, primarily Czechoslovakia, which sold arms to the new Jewish state, in a transaction that reflected Cold War calculations more than ideological alignment. The Haganah, which became the Israel Defense Forces in the war's early weeks, fought the war's first phase under conditions of genuine military inferiority, absorbing losses that a more established military structure might not have survived. The war turned as the Czech arms began arriving and as the Arab coalition's military coordination proved far less effective than its combined numbers suggested it should be. The Egyptian army, the largest of the Arab forces, had equipment problems, supply problems, and command problems. The Jordanian Arab Legion, the most professional and most effective of the Arab forces, was operating under a specific political instruction from King Abdullah that reflected his private understanding with the Israeli leadership, an understanding that Jordan would not fight for Palestinian territory beyond the West Bank, which Abdullah intended to absorb into his kingdom regardless of the war's outcome. The Syrian and Iraqi forces conducted operations that fell short of their stated military objectives. The Arab coalition that had been presented to the world as a unified force committed to the same political goal was, in practice, 5 separate armies pursuing 5 separate national interests in a common theater. The Palestinian refugee exodus happened across the full course of the war, and it happened for multiple reasons that the historical debate has been arguing about ever since. Some Palestinians fled in the early stages of the fighting because they were afraid, because they had seen what war did to civilians, because they had heard reports of fighting in nearby areas, because they calculated that leaving temporarily until the Arab armies won was safer than staying. Some were ordered to leave by Arab military commanders who believed that clearing civilians from combat zones was a military necessity. Some were expelled by Israeli military forces who concluded, during operations, that the presence of Arab civilians in specific locations represented a military risk that removal addressed. And some were killed in what the Israeli historian Benny Morris documented in his pioneering research as approximately 24 massacres, the most notorious of which was the killing of between 100 and 120 people at the village of Deir Yassin in April 1948 by Irgun and Stern Gang forces, an event whose news spread through Palestinian communities and accelerated the flight of others who concluded that remaining was more dangerous than leaving. The village of Deir Yassin is worth understanding not as the totality of what happened, but as the specific event that most clearly shows the complexity of the refugee question. The people who were killed there were civilians. The killing was documented by Israeli investigators who condemned it. It was used by Arab radio broadcasts which exaggerated the atrocity even beyond its actual horror as evidence of what would happen to Palestinians who remained. The effect of those broadcasts was to produce additional flight. The specific interaction between military violence, deliberate psychological warfare, and civilian panic produced outcomes that none of the parties fully controlled, and that all of the parties used, selectively, to support the narrative that served their political position. By the armistice agreements of 1949, Israel controlled approximately 78% of mandatory Palestine, significantly more than the 56% the UN partition plan had assigned. The remaining 22% was divided between Jordan, which controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Egypt, which controlled the Gaza Strip. The 700,000 Palestinian refugees who had left during the war were not permitted to return. The Israeli government's position that the return of hundreds of thousands of Arab refugees into a country that had just fought a war of survival against Arab armies would be a security threat that no new state could accept, was politically rational but humanly devastating for the people it affected. The Arab states that had gone to war to prevent Israel's creation now hosted the refugees that the war had produced, in camps that were intended to be temporary and that became permanent. The armistice agreements ended the shooting. They did not end the conflict. They froze it, in a configuration Israel established and armed, the Palestinian refugees, stateless and waiting. The Arab states defeated but unreconciled to what they had lost, that produced the next 7 decades of wars and negotiations and failed peace processes and human suffering that make up the rest of this story. The armistice agreements of 1949 created not peace, but a specific form of suspended hostility, a frozen conflict in which the shooting had stopped, but the fundamental disagreement about whether Israel had the right to exist had not been resolved and was not being resolved. The Arab states that signed the armistice agreements did so with explicit language specifying that the armistices were military arrangements, not political recognitions, not concessions that Israel was a legitimate state, not acknowledgements that the war's outcome was final. Egypt signed, Jordan signed, Syria signed, and all of them signed with the understanding, communicated clearly to their own populations and to the Palestinian refugees in the camps, that this was a pause rather than a conclusion. The Palestinian refugees in the camps in Lebanon and Jordan and Syria and the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip were told they would return. They were not told that the promise of return required another war to fulfill, and that the next war, and the one after that, would produce outcomes even further from what they were waiting for. Israel's first decade of existence was defined by the specific challenges of building a state under permanent siege. The mass immigration of the 1950s, Jewish refugees from the Arab countries that were expelling their Jewish populations in the aftermath of 1948, Holocaust survivors who had been waiting in European displaced persons camps, immigrants from Yemen and Morocco and Iraq, doubled the Jewish population in a few years and created the specific ethnic and social tensions of a society, being built from extraordinarily diverse human material under the pressure of a security environment. That did not permit the luxury of gradual integration. The Israeli economy of the early 1950s was essentially a command economy, with severe rationing of basic goods, that required the German reparations agreement of 1952, deeply controversial within Israeli society, condemned by those who believed that accepting German money was a moral betrayal of the Holocaust's dead to provide the financial foundation for the industrial development that would eventually produce one of the most successful economies in the Middle East. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was a collision of the old world and the new of the European colonial powers, who still believed they could organize the Middle East according to their strategic interests and the American superpower. That had decided that the era of European colonialism was over, that its own interests required a different framework. When Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956, the British and French governments that had built and operated the canal concluded that military action to reverse the nationalization was both necessary and justified. They recruited Israel, which had its own grievances against Egypt. The blockade of the Gulf of Aqaba, the Fedayeen raids from Gaza, the Egyptian military buildup in the Sinai into a secret collusion in which Israel would attack Egypt, and Britain and France would then intervene as ostensible peacekeepers to occupy the canal zone. The military operation worked. The political operation collapsed when both the United States and the Soviet Union, for different reasons, demanded a withdrawal that Britain and France could not refuse. Israel withdrew from the Sinai, receiving in return an international guarantee of free navigation in the Gulf of Aqaba that Egypt would violate 11 years later, triggering the crisis that produced the Six-Day War. The years between 1956 and 1967 were the years in which Nasser's pan-Arab nationalism reached its peak and then began its decline, in which the Palestinian Fedayeen guerrilla fighters, operating from Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon conducted raids into Israel that kept the security situation permanently unstable, and in which the arms race between Israel and its Arab neighbors was accelerated by the Cold War's superpower competition that equipped both sides with increasingly sophisticated weapons. The specific crisis of May 1967 inches, which Nasser demanded the withdrawal of UN peacekeeping forces from the Sinai, closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, and concluded military agreements with Jordan and Syria that positioned Arab forces on 3 of Israel's borders, was interpreted in Israel as the preparation for a war whose opening Arab attack would be existential in its consequences if it succeeded. The Six-Day War began on the 5th of June, 1967, with an Israeli airstrike that destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in the first hours of the fighting, a preemptive strike that was a military masterstroke and a political act of enormous consequence, because it meant that Israel had started the shooting, even if the conditions that preceded it made that start comprehensible. In 6 days, the most successful military campaign in the history of the modern Middle East transformed the map of the region in ways that are still being argued about and fought over. The Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel's territory tripled. Approximately 1 million Palestinian Arabs came under Israeli military occupation overnight. The capture of East Jerusalem and the Old City was the moment whose emotional impact on Israeli society most completely exceeded anything military or political calculation could contain. Israeli paratroopers reaching the Western Wall, the last surviving remnant of the Temple Mount complex, the holiest physical location in Judaism, and weeping and praying, were not performing for the cameras. They were experiencing something that the previous 19 years of Israeli statehood, the previous 2,000 years of diaspora, the previous 3,000 years of Jewish connection to that specific place, had made overwhelming. The military commander of Jerusalem, Moshe Dayan, stood at the wall and said that Israel had returned to its holiest sites and would never leave them. He meant it. The problem was that a significant portion of the population that lived in the captured territory, 1 million people in the West Bank, hundreds of thousands in Gaza, also had no intention of leaving, and they were now under the authority of a state that had not decided what to do with them or with the land they lived on. What Israel did with the captured territories in the years that followed, and what it did not do, produced the specific political geography of the contemporary conflict. The decisions made in the years after 1967, particularly the decision to allow and then to encourage Jewish settlement in the occupied territories, created the conditions that every subsequent attempt at peace has had to confront. Understanding those decisions requires understanding both the ideology that drove them and the specific political logic that made them, year by year, appear more defensible than the alternative. The morning after the Six-Day War ended, Israel found itself governing a territory it had not planned for, and a population it had not decided what to do with. The West Bank contained approximately 600,000 Palestinian Arabs. The Gaza Strip contained another 300,000, plus approximately 300,000 Palestinian refugees who had fled there in 1948 and had been living in camps under Egyptian administration since. These people were not Israeli citizens. They were not Jordanian citizens, though many carried Jordanian travel documents. They were not citizens of anything. They were the population of a territory that Israel now controlled militarily and had not yet decided, politically, what to call. The occupation that began in June 1967 with the temporary logic of military necessity would still be in place 6 decades later, having produced along the way the settlement movement, the Intifada, the Oslo process, and the specific political geography of the contemporary conflict. What began as a temporary military administration became, through a series of decisions that each appeared rational at the time they were made, a permanent feature of the landscape that every subsequent peace process has had to navigate around. The settlement movement did not begin with an official government decision. It began with a group of religious Zionists who, in the weeks after the Six-Day War, drove to Hebron, the city in the West Bank, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were buried, according to Jewish tradition, a city of profound religious significance, and announced that they were settling there. The Israeli government of the time was not sure what to do with them. Some ministers wanted them removed. Others argued that Jewish presence in Hebron had existed for centuries before the 1929 massacre expelled the Jewish community, and that re-establishing it was historically legitimate. The settlers stayed. The logic that permitted them to stay, that the biblical heartland of Jewish history, was not foreign territory, but the deepest expression of the Jewish connection to the land, was not a logic that the Israeli government formally adopted, but that it progressively accommodated, tolerating and then facilitating, and then actively supporting the construction of Jewish communities in the occupied territories. Each new settlement appeared, to its supporters, to be solving a specific problem: security, historical connection, housing for a growing population. Each new settlement also created new problems. It required Israeli military forces to protect the settlers from the Palestinian population around them. It required roads and infrastructure that cut through Palestinian territory, and it moved the political center of gravity of Israeli domestic politics in a direction that made any government willing to remove settlements face a more difficult internal battle than the government that had tolerated their construction. The settlements were not strategically irrational, in the specific sense that military planners could point to specific locations where Jewish communities provided early warning capability or controlled strategic high ground. They were politically catastrophic, in the sense that they created, year by year, a political constituency whose interests were incompatible with any territorial compromise that could produce a Palestinian state. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was created in 1964 by the Arab League, as a vehicle for Palestinian political and military action, and under Yasser Arafat's leadership, from 1969 onward, it became the most significant Palestinian political force in the world, simultaneously a government in exile that represented Palestinian political aspirations on the international stage and a military organization that conducted operations that Israel and the Western world characterized as terrorism. The specific operations, the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre of 11 Israeli athletes, conducted not by the PLO itself, but by the Black September organization whose connection to the PLO was deliberately obscured. The airplane hijackings, the attacks on Israeli civilians in Israel and abroad were politically catastrophic for the Palestinian cause in the Western world, and were also, from the PLO's perspective, the only tools available to a stateless people with no army, no territory, and no other mechanism for keeping the Palestinian question on the international agenda. The logic was ruthless, and the methods were inexcusable. They also worked, in the specific sense that the Palestinian question remained on the international agenda in ways that it would not have without the PLO's insistence on forcing it there. The Yom Kippur War of October 1973, the Egyptian and Syrian surprise attack on the Jewish holy day that initially overwhelmed Israeli defenses and produced the most dangerous military situation Israel had faced since 1948, shook Israeli society in ways that the subsequent military recovery did not fully repair. The intelligence failure that allowed the attack to achieve surprise, the early casualties, the sense that the invincibility the Six-Day War had seemed to establish was more conditional than it appeared. These produced a political crisis that contributed to the eventual downfall of the Labour Party that had governed Israel. Since its founding, the Egyptian crossing of the Suez Canal, which had seemed impossible, demonstrated that the Arab states were capable of military planning that could catch Israel unprepared. It also, paradoxically, created the conditions for peace because Anwar Sadat, who had ordered the attack, had achieved what he needed to achieve politically. He had demonstrated that Egypt could fight Israel effectively, and the demonstration gave him the domestic political standing to make peace. The Camp David Accords of 1978, brokered by Jimmy Carter through 13 days of intensive negotiation at the presidential retreat, produced the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty that returned the Sinai to Egypt and gave Israel the formal recognition from its most powerful Arab neighbor that it had been seeking since 1948. The peace was real, in the sense that it has held for 45 years without a war between the two countries. It was also limited, in the sense that it addressed the territorial question between two states with defined borders, while leaving the Palestinian question the harder question, the question of a stateless people under military occupation whose land was being progressively settled explicitly deferred. The Palestinian question that Camp David deferred did not wait patiently for the diplomatic process to address it. It was accumulating, year by year, in the specific human experience of the occupation, in the checkpoints, and the permits, and the administrative controls, and the land confiscations, and the settlement construction into a pressure that would eventually produce the uprising that forced the world to acknowledge what the occupation was actually costing. The First Intifada did not begin with a military operation or a political decision. It began in December, 1987 inches, the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, when an Israeli military vehicle struck a car and killed 4 Palestinian workers, and the rumor spread through the camp incorrectly, but with the specific velocity of a story that people were already prepared to believe that the killing had been deliberate. The uprising that began in Jabalia that night spread through Gaza and then the West Bank within days, and what distinguished it from previous Palestinian violence was not its intensity, but its character. Young men and children throwing stones at Israeli soldiers, general strikes, the flying of Palestinian flags that Israeli military regulations had prohibited. The specific visual of stone throwers facing armed soldiers was not accidentally powerful. It was the image of an occupied population that had decided, after 20 years of military administration, that the cost of resistance was lower than the cost of continued submission, and that the tools of civil disobedience were available to people who had no army. The First Intifada lasted 6 years, killed approximately 1,100 Palestinians and 160 Israelis, and produced in Israeli society a specific recognition that the occupation was not cost-free. Not cost-free financially, not cost-free in terms of the military service it required, not cost-free in terms of the moral questions it raised for Israeli soldiers who were being asked to enforce military administration over a civilian population that was resisting with stones. The images that appeared on Israeli television and international news soldiers using clubs to beat protesters, the detention of thousands of young Palestinian men, the house demolitions used as collective punishment were not abstract policy debates. They were visible to Israeli families every night, and what they were making visible was the specific human cost of an occupation that the peace camp had been arguing for years was unsustainable. The Oslo Accords were negotiated in secret, which is why they succeeded where the public diplomatic process had consistently failed. Norwegian diplomats organized a back channel between Israeli academics and PLO officials in which the absence of official positions allowed the conversations to proceed without the political constraints that official negotiations imposed. What emerged, after months of secret meetings, was a framework agreement that both sides' political leaderships could accept, because it was ambiguous enough about the hardest issues to allow each side to present it to their constituency as a document that protected their essential interests. The mutual recognition, Israel recognizing the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, the PLO recognizing Israel's right to exist and renouncing terrorism, was the most significant single political act of the entire conflict's history, because it converted the two sides from adversaries who denied each other's fundamental legitimacy into negotiating parties who acknowledged each other's existence. The handshake on the White House lawn on the 13th of September, 1993, Yasser Arafat, extending his hand, Yitzhak Rabin, accepting it with the visible reluctance of a man who has decided that what he is doing is necessary and has not quite finished deciding whether he is comfortable with. It was watched by people around the world with the specific emotion of people who had spent years believing that this moment was impossible and were discovering that it was happening. The Palestinian Authority was established. Israeli forces withdrew from Palestinian population centers in the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinian elections were held. For a few years, the framework appeared to be producing not peace, but the preconditions for peace, the institutional development that a future Palestinian state would require, the confidence building that both sides needed before they could address the final status issues that Oslo had deliberately deferred. Yitzhak Rabin was shot twice in the back by Yigal Amir, a young Israeli law student who believed that the Oslo peace process was a betrayal of the land that God had promised the Jewish people on the night of November 4. Etienne Joshawu, in a Tel Aviv public square where Rabin had just addressed a peace rally. He died on the operating table 90 minutes later. The assassination was the most consequential single act of political violence in Israeli history, not because Rabin was irreplaceable, no one is irreplaceable, but because the specific combination of military credibility and political will that Rabin brought to the peace process was not reproduced by the political leaders who followed him. Shimon Peres, who succeeded him and lost the subsequent election by fewer than 30,000 votes to Benjamin Netanyahu, had the political will but not the military credibility. Netanyahu had neither the will nor, arguably, the desire. The political momentum of Oslo survived Rabin's assassination technically, but it did not survive it politically. The Camp David summit of July 2000 was the Clinton administration's attempt to convert the Oslo framework into a final agreement before Clinton's presidency ended. Ehud Barak came to Camp David with an offer that was, by any historical comparison, more significant than any Israeli government had previously been willing to offer approximately 91% of the West Bank. Palestinian sovereignty in Gaza, Palestinian control of Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, a form of sovereignty over parts of the Old City. Arafat did not accept it. He did not make a counter-proposal. Whether his failure to respond was the product of political paralysis, of the specific deficiencies of what was actually on the table, of the absence of a detailed written proposal that he could take back to his people, or of a fundamental unwillingness to sign an agreement that required him to formally close the Palestinian refugee question. The most politically toxic issue in Palestinian politics is a question that the historical record does not definitively answer. What it produced was the collapse of the summit, the outbreak of the Second Intifada 2 months later, and the specific political environment in which every subsequent negotiation has taken place. The Second Intifada that began in September 2000 was different from the first, in ways that made it more politically destructive to the peace process than even the failure of Camp David. It was more violent. It produced more Israeli civilian casualties, and it produced in Israeli society a specific political shift away from the peace camp that has not been fully reversed. What it also produced was Hamas not created by the Second Intifada, but strengthened by it, waiting for its opportunity. The Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated pieces of territory on Earth, approximately 365 square kilometers, roughly twice the size of Washington, D.C., containing before October 2023 approximately 2.3 million people the majority of them descendants of the Palestinian refugees who fled or were expelled during the 1948 war, and who have lived in this narrow coastal strip for 3 generations without citizenship in any state, without the right to return to the places their families came from, and without the economic freedom that a population under blockade cannot possess. Gaza is not merely a political problem. It is a specific human reality. Millions of people living in conditions that the United Nations has been characterizing as a humanitarian crisis since before 2007, in a territory that Israel controls from the outside, that Egypt controls from the south, and that Hamas controls from within, and where the specific interests of all 3 controlling parties have consistently taken priority over the basic welfare of the people living there. Hamas was founded in 1987 by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, a wheelchair-bound cleric who had been building the Gaza branch of the Muslim Brotherhood's social welfare infrastructure for years, and who understood that the specific failure of secular Palestinian nationalism to deliver either dignity or statehood had created political space for an Islamist alternative that offered not just a political program, but a religious framework for understanding the conflict and a practical network of schools and clinics and social services that the Palestinian Authority was not providing adequately. The combination of ideology and services is the foundation of every successful Islamist political movement in the modern Middle East, and Hamas deployed it in Gaza with an effectiveness that the Palestinian Authority's secular nationalist alternative could not match, precisely because the Palestinian Authority was simultaneously governing under occupation, negotiating with Israel, and managing the corruption that accumulates in any political organization that controls resources without genuine accountability to its population. Israel's 2005 unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, in which Ariel Sharon, the Israeli Prime Minister, who had been one of the most aggressive supporters of the settlement movement throughout his career, ordered the removal of all 8,000 Israeli settlers from Gaza, and the withdrawal of Israeli military forces from the territory, was the most significant single act of territorial concession in Israeli political history, and it produced an outcome that strengthened every Israeli political argument against future withdrawals. Hamas, which had been conducting suicide bombing attacks throughout the Second Intifada and had not participated in the negotiations that led to the withdrawal, claimed the withdrawal as a victory for its armed resistance, the proof that violence worked where Oslo's negotiation had not. The Palestinian Authority, which had participated in the negotiations, received none of the credit that the withdrawal might have given it. Hamas won the subsequent Palestinian legislative elections in 2006 with a political argument that the facts appeared to support. The Hamas government that took power in Gaza in 2007 after the violent confrontation with Fatah forces that produced the complete territorial separation of Gaza from the West Bank immediately triggered the Israeli and Egyptian blockade that has been in place since. The blockade's stated purpose was to prevent weapons from reaching Hamas. Its actual effect was to restrict the movement of goods and people in and out of the territory in ways that progressively collapsed the civilian economy while being sufficiently porous to allow Hamas to import the rocket components and military materials that it used to conduct attacks on Israeli civilians. The blockade was not achieving its stated security objective. It was achieving the collective punishment of a civilian population for the political choices of its government in ways that the United Nations and every major human rights organization documented in consistent detail over 16 years, without that documentation changing the fundamental policy. The rockets that Hamas fired from Gaza into Israeli territory, progressively more sophisticated, progressively longer ranged, reaching from the initial range that covered communities near the Gaza border to the eventual range that could reach Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, were the military expression of an Islamist movement's commitment to resistance, that its ideology defined as non-negotiable. They were also, from the perspective of the Israeli communities within range, a genuine security threat that disrupted daily life, forced repeated evacuations, and produced the specific political pressure on Israeli governments to respond militarily that Hamas's strategic logic appears to have calculated, would produce either a disproportionate Israeli response that would generate international condemnation or a gradual erosion of Israeli security. that would demonstrate Hamas's capacity to impose costs. The 4 military operations Israel conducted in Gaza between 2008 and 2021 before October 2023 cast lead, pillar of defense, protective edge, guardian of the walls followed a consistent pattern of Israeli military operations that killed thousands of Palestinians, damaged or destroyed large portions of Gaza's civilian infrastructure, temporarily reduced Hamas's military capacity, and produced outcomes in which Hamas retained control of Gaza and the conditions that produced the conflict remained in place. The 7th of October 2023 Hamas attack on Israel was qualitatively different from anything that had preceded it. Approximately 3:00 Hamas fighters breached the Gaza security barrier in multiple locations in the pre-dawn hours of the Simchat Torah holiday, overran Israeli military bases, and attacked the kibbutzim and towns and a music festival near the Gaza border with a combination of firearms and barbarity that killed approximately 1,200 people, the majority of them civilians, and took approximately 250 hostage. It was the deadliest single day for Jewish people since the Holocaust, and the Israeli military and intelligence failure that allowed it was of a scale that produced immediate political crisis alongside the military response. The Israeli military response in Gaza has produced, at the time this documentary is being written, one of the highest concentrations of civilian casualties in any military conflict of the modern era, in a territory whose extreme population density makes the distinction between military and civilian targets operationally impossible to maintain with the precision that the laws of war require. The hostage situation, the regional escalation involving Hezbollah and Iran, the collapse of the Abraham Accords' diplomatic momentum, all of these have produced a situation whose outcome cannot be predicted. The history that produced the 7th of October 2023 and the history that the 7th of October 2023 is producing will be argued about and analyzed for as long as people care about this conflict. What cannot be argued about is the human cost on both sides of a conflict whose resolution has never been as distant as it is at this moment. The final chapter of this documentary does not offer resolution. It offers the only honest thing available, an attempt to understand what the history means and what it might require of everyone who lives in its shadow. 75 years after David Ben-Gurion stood in a Tel Aviv museum and read the words that brought the State of Israel into existence, the state, he declared, is by every conventional measure of national success a remarkable achievement. A country of 650,000 people in 1948 has become a country of 9 million. An economy held together in its first decade by rationing and German reparations has become one of the most technologically advanced in the world. A startup nation, in the phrase that became a global brand, producing more companies listed on the American Nasdaq exchange than any country except the United States and China. A democracy that has held elections without interruption since its founding, including under the conditions of multiple wars, has sustained the institutional structure of self-governance through challenges that have collapsed democratic systems with longer histories in other countries. Hebrew, a language that had not been spoken as a daily vernacular for 2,000 years, has been revived as the language of a functioning modern society. These achievements are real, and they are not diminished by honest acknowledgement of what was produced alongside them. What was produced alongside them is equally real, and the specific evasion that Israeli national narrative and its supporters have most consistently practiced is the evasion of this simultaneity, the insistence that the achievement and the cost can be separated, that Israel's extraordinary state-building can be appreciated without accounting for the specific human experience of the people who paid a significant portion of its price. The Palestinian families who left or were expelled from their villages in 1948 and who are today represented by approximately 5 million registered refugees in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and the West Bank and Gaza are not an abstraction. They are specific people with specific family histories and specific claims to specific pieces of land and specific keys, the literal house keys that became the symbol of the Nakba that their grandparents carried when they left, and that their grandchildren have inherited as the physical evidence of what was lost. The key as an object of memory is not a political argument. It is the material expression of a family's relationship to a home that no longer exists in the form they remember it, in a country that has told them they cannot return. The law of return, which guarantees any Jewish person in the world the right to immigrate to Israel and receive citizenship, is the most direct institutional expression of the principle that the Holocaust established as necessary, that a state must exist that will receive any Jew who needs refuge from the specific danger of anti-Semitism, which history has demonstrated repeatedly, is not a safely ignorable constant of human social life, but an active force capable of producing mass murder in sophisticated industrial societies. The law has been used by hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews who emigrated in the 1990s, by Ethiopian Jews airlifted in Operation Moses and Operation Solomon, by Yemenite Jews, by Iraqi and Moroccan and Iranian Jews who left communities that had existed for millennia when those communities became untenable after 1948. The law of return is also, to Palestinian eyes, the specific institutional expression of a double standard, the right that guarantees any Jewish person in the world. Citizenship in Israel is precisely the right that Palestinian refugees are denied to return to the land from which their families were displaced. Both perspectives on the same law are coherent, and the law's existence is a permanent reminder that the conflict has not been resolved but managed, and that the management has been consistently more favorable to one side than the other. The Arab world's relationship with the Palestinian cause has undergone a transformation that the Palestinian people have experienced as a progressive abandonment. The pan-Arab nationalism of Nasser's era treated Palestinian statehood as a commitment that the Arab world shared a political responsibility that justified going to war in 1948, in 1967, in 1973. The Abraham Accords of 2020, in which the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain established diplomatic relations with Israel without requiring a Palestinian state as a precondition, were the clearest single expression of a shift that had been accumulating for years. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states have been conducting pragmatic engagement with Israel for decades, driven by shared concerns about Iranian power and shared interests in economic cooperation that has progressively subordinated the Palestinian cause to the specific national interests of states that found Israeli partnership more immediately useful than Palestinian solidarity. The Palestinian people, who had always been represented by Arab states whose solidarity was conditional on those states' other interests, discovered that the conditionality had been present from the beginning, and that the conditions had changed in ways that were not favorable to them. The international legal framework that was supposed to govern the conflict's resolution has produced, over 75 years, a body of resolutions and advisory opinions and treaty obligations that are more complete as a documentation of the world's stated values than as an enforcement mechanism for those values. UN Security Council Resolution 242, passed after the 1967 war, calls for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories and acknowledgement of every state's right to peace within secure borders. It has not been implemented in its territorial dimension in 57 years. The International Court of Justice's 2004 advisory opinion declaring the separation barrier Israel built in the West Bank illegal under international law was ignored by Israel and by the United States, which used its Security Council veto to prevent enforcement. The gap between the principles that international law articulates and the power that enforces those principles is not a gap that is unique to this conflict, but the gap in this conflict is particularly visible because the documentation of the principles is so complete and the enforcement is so absent. The philosophical question that the history of Israel poses with the greatest urgency is one that the history refuses to answer cleanly. What do you do when two genuine claims, both with legitimate historical and moral foundations, cannot both be fully satisfied in the same physical space? The Zionist claim was genuine. The Palestinian claim was genuine. Both were acknowledged. Neither rejection of the other's claim has produced anything better than what was being rejected. Every war has produced more grief. Every failed negotiation has made the next negotiation harder. Every settlement built in the occupied territories has made the territorial compromise that peace requires more physically and politically difficult to implement. The people paying the highest price in any given moment are not usually the people making the decisions. What do you think? A strip of land the size of New Jersey has produced more history than most continents. A people who survived 2,000 years of exile and the Holocaust built a state that is simultaneously a remarkable human achievement and the source of a conflict that has displaced and killed hundreds of thousands of people across 75 years. Could a different set of decisions at the Balfour Declaration, or the 1947 partition, or Camp David, or Oslo, have produced a different outcome? Could the specific combination of ancient claims, colonial promises, and modern nationalism that produced this conflict find its equivalent somewhere in the world today, in places where the past has not finished with the present, and the present has not yet decided what to do with the past? Leave your thoughts below, because the history of Israel is not a story with a clear villain and a clear victim. It is a story about what happens when history's deepest wounds meet the specific limitations of the political tools that human beings have developed for resolving them, and it is a story that is still being written, in the lives of people on both sides, who did not choose to be born into it and cannot choose to leave it.